Well, good evening, Rambler parents, and welcome. We are so happy tonight to put on this presentation with our great partners over at Compass Health. And tonight we are joined by Emily and Margaret, and they're going to take us through about 40 minutes of information about pandemic parenting, some strategies for supporting students, and for building resilient teens. Obviously, this is a very important and timely topic. Tomorrow ends our first quarter, which has been unlike any first quarter we've ever had in the 110 history of Loyola Academy. But we're getting through it, and we're doing well. And I love seeing the students in the building every day, making our job a lot easier and much more valuable has been working with Sheila Blanchfield and her crew down in the counseling department. So I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Counseling, Sheila Blanchfield, and she's going to introduce our presenters for the evening.
Thank you, Principal Heinz. Welcome, everybody. I saw a lot of familiar names in there. I wish I could see you all. This will be recorded and we will share it. It'll be on our on-campus, the counseling resource tile, and it will also be posted on Compass's website. So I want to just share our gratitude for Compass for partnering with us. They really understand the needs of our community and have been working closely with our department, our counseling department, to really address the needs of our parents and our students. So we are offering this program as parent-teacher conferences are coming up next week. We wanted to have some tools in the toolbox for you as you sit down and talk with your students about strategies for their academics, while also definitely meeting the needs of their mental health, as this can be and is a very stressful time for everyone as we navigate our uncharted waters together. So there will be more parent programming coming each quarter with Compass. And in gratitude to our two panelists so much, I am going to introduce Margaret Lewis. She's a licensed clinical social worker. Margaret graduated from Northwestern University with a degree in Human Development and Psychology Services and received her master's in social work from the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration. She completed graduate training at Alternatives Inc. and Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. Margaret has worked with children and families in schools, residential, outpatient, in-home, and hospital settings over the past decade. She joined Compass in 2017 and is the Director of Adolescent Partial Hospitalization Program at Compass Health Center in Northbrook. Emily Crane has her master's in education, and she's worked as a teacher and school administrator in both public and private schools in Chicago, as well as the suburbs, for more than 20 years. She holds a master's degree in curriculum development and has been employed at as the education specialist at Compass for over 5 years. Emily also has two students, a sophomore and a senior, at Highland Park High School right now, so she is commiserating with all of you, as well as a sophomore at the University of Illinois. It's been a pleasure to partner with both of them to bring you this presentation. I'm excited to turn it over to Margaret.
Thank you so much, Principal Heinz and Sheila. We are thrilled to be partnering with you again. I'm really excited for some time together this evening. Our goal, as was shared, is really giving some ideas of the themes that we've been talking about with our adolescents and families, and things that we hope you can take away as some tangible strategies or ideas and things that might be useful for your families during these uncertain times. We will, like was mentioned, have the recording available, as well as some resources and slides afterward. We will have a Q&A at the end as well, so if you have questions that come up, please hang on to those, and Emily and I will do our best to address anything and everything we can. We truly want this evening to be something that's really useful for all of you. So to get us started, some of the topics we want to cover, talking a little bit about understanding the emotions that are coming up for many of our teens and families now, and how to help process those and our reactions to them, some coping skills and support techniques. Also, some ways we can kind of look forward, knowing that you have parent conferences coming up, an ever-changing school schedule and routine, and also things coming up the rest of this academic year. We did start our partnership around webinars actually all the way back in March, when the pandemic felt very new, and that is all available for you to access too. One of the things we talked about as we were preparing this is how many things have changed since then. And so recognizing that at the beginning of COVID, a lot of us had a sense of shock and kind of just being in go mode. And now we've kind of normalized some things, and things still feel like they're ever changing. And so just being really mindful for all of us as we enter the conversation, kind of what COVID has looked like for us and our families so far, and how things are maybe continuing to shift and change. One thing we've spent a lot of time talking about and trying to understand more about is really how we can understand the experience of this pandemic through a lens of grief, loss, and trauma. And there's been a great deal of research that's come out about the ways in which COVID has taken certain things from us and given us other opportunities. But in the sense of grief and loss, recognizing that for our students, there's a loss of things from sports season to prom to the senior year maybe they expected, or the freshman year they were hoping for. And so being mindful that this loss is really ambiguous. And what we mean by that is that there's not necessarily a specific label or a timeline that we know, right? There's no like Hallmark card we can give, like, sorry, you didn't have, the musical that you wanted to be in this spring, or really frustrating, you haven't been able to see your friends for a long time. So just recognizing that even though we might not have specific names or labels, that sense of grief or loss can be real for a lot of us. It's also not linear. Many of us have this idea that we would process kind of losses or grief in stages, and truly it can ebb and flow from maybe sometimes feeling okay, other times being in denial or being really frustrated or irritable about it. So wanting to normalize that experience for a lot of us. I think probably the number one phrase we've talked about is tolerating uncertainty. So recognizing that at each phase of this pandemic we've gone through, we've had a lot of questions of like, what if, or what next, or when will this happen? And the idea that being able to tolerate that uncertainty and not knowing is stressful and also is a skill. It requires us to practice and really build that muscle, and thinking about how we can model that for our teens and families. And lastly, trying to be mindful of, amidst all that uncertainty, how can we still plan things? How can we cope ahead, or maybe prep for things we think could be exciting, stressful, challenging for our families? Emily and I found this and thought it was really interesting. We do a lot of visuals with teens and families in terms of trying to be more comfortable talking about and identifying our emotions, and just thought this was a cute way to think through how many different phases emotionally many of us have been in, and maybe even circling through a few lines of this chart within a day or two. So just keeping in mind that we all are going through a lot. And one thing we talk a lot about with teens and families is understanding how we're feeling. We have our kids in school for hours every day, learning a lot of academic skills and other things, and we don't necessarily teach skills for how to identify, express, or sit with our emotions. So trying to build that skill of being more comfortable and being more specific with what is going on. We often talk about, if you can name it, you can tame it, right? So some of the feelings that Emily and I have had a lot of experience exploring recently with our teenagers and families, one is fatigue. So I know a lot of us talk about Zoom fatigue or fatigue from being on screens. Recognizing that that is real. It's also real that a lot of us are tired from going through the past 6+ months, and there's a fatigue of the not knowing and the uncertainty. Really normal to feel more anxious. So for some teens, feeling that overall, other times seeing that come up with things that might have been a little deal now feel like a big deal. Normal to feel sad and have that sense of being down or maybe low energy at times. Normal to be more irritable, particularly when we're all at home together. I'm sure a lot of us have seen our fuses maybe be shorter with each other, or it be hard to tolerate little things that don't go our way. And lastly, a lot of feeling low motivation or stuck. I think sometimes the idea of not knowing what comes next or still processing the past few months can make it hard to feel like there's a lot of momentum. And one thing we talk a lot about with our students is, unfortunately, we can't order motivation on Amazon Prime. We can't necessarily wait for the day we wake up and feel more motivated. So what are the ways that we can help increase that momentum through, whether it be healthy sleep or hobbies or setting small things to look forward to, So those are a lot of what's been coming up for us in conversations with teens and families. Is there anything you want to add here, Emily?
So I think I would add, thank you very much. It's good to be with everyone. I think I would add that the fatigue is unique in teenagers. It's different than it is in adults. It takes a lot of energy to be a teenager in general. The level of energy and angst attached to what our teenagers are going through, everything is very amplified for them. So fatigue for them is deeper and more profound, and it's often very visible. And they're also, they really struggle to muscle through it and on a regular basis. I would say that that's probably, it's certainly as a teacher and as a parent, that I see a lot of really deep, profound fatigue, like physically and emotionally. We need to be really understanding of that.
That makes sense. I think it's definitely different. We know teenagers always have a lot of big feelings, and so knowing that that could be magnified. On the flip side, you know, as a clinician and as a team that likes to be optimistic, I think also making space for emotions that might feel more comfortable, right? We try to stay away from saying emotions are positive or negative or good or bad, but things that might feel easier for us to try on or may feel more rare, and being mindful of how can we name for ourselves and for our teens, what are the moments where we do feel hopeful? Like, let's talk about and celebrate not just that we felt really drained after e-learning one day. Let's also make as much space to talk about how exciting it was that we got to, you know, maybe see our neighbors for the first time, even with a mask on, but just to be outside and give a wave, or how nice it was to be able to actually like remember your locker combination and feel like you're a student in the hallways again. Thinking of the times that we might have been inspired to do something creative or try differently, and really trying to, again, pause and make some space for that. Times we might feel joyful or can be proud of ourselves, or really validate our teens for, hey, like, I know you've been really drained this week with e-learning. I'm proud of you for being able to, you know, get that assignment turned in, or I appreciate that you're really present when we're playing a game together. And also ways we can be grateful, right? There's a lot of research around the idea of practicing gratitude and mindfulness, and not that, you know, saying we're grateful for 3 things is going to make us or our teens feel better right away. And it does help to train our brains to kind of, rather than just focus on the stress in moments like these pandemics, also have those pathways, Warren, of what am I grateful for, or what are the things that I can still, you know, make space for that feel happy or joyous.
And I would add, modeling that language and that kind of talking for our teens helps them to internalize it as well. So if we're able to identify things that we feel good about that we've done, and share that with our kids, they're able to turn around and do the same thing for themselves. I had a great moment today. I'm really hopeful that tomorrow looks similar. Or I felt really, I had a really positive experience with regard to this, and I'm very grateful that I had that moment. It really set the tone for the rest of my day.
Mm-hmm. And normalizing that we might be stressed or grateful about very different things now, right? And trying to keep it in the present rather than comparing it to like pre-COVID or forecasting to potentially post-COVID. I think that can be important as well. So let's say we're naming these feelings with our teens and talking through them. I think the next piece is, how do we tolerate them, right? We cannot control the emotions that come up for us. Ignoring them doesn't tend to work, and we can't force them to change or go away. So a lot of the work is really to say, can we identify specifically what we're feeling? Can we express it? Can we accept that it's there? And then can we separate ourselves from it, or recognize that we are not our emotions? Particularly for teenagers, I think there's a tendency to fuse either with a really intense thought like, I'm never going to be able to play sports again, or no one likes me, or a really intense emotion of feeling maybe left out or sad. And it can become where that emotion or strong thought takes over everything. And so how do we help ourselves and our teens say, I'm still a person who's having this feeling, or I'm experiencing this emotion, I'm noticing this thought, rather than having that take up all of our space. So for us, I think that's a lot of the work, is kind of working through this and modeling that for our teens. One thing that can be helpful, particularly with teenagers, where we know a lot of the responses that Emily and I will get is, I'm fine, I'm tired, I'm okay, I'm whatever. So we will often challenge those aren't necessarily specific feelings. And if your teen isn't one who's used to talking about the emotion words, this kind of a visual can be really helpful. So in the middle here, we have some of the core emotions, but as you go out We also have some physical sensations. So, if your teen is one who might be not as quick to identify, can you try reflecting back and saying, I'm noticing that you are really kind of fidgety. Like, what are you feeling? Or does that mean you're maybe feeling on edge? And kind of reflecting back what you're seeing and helping to make that connection of, if there's too much going on in our brains to sort out, our bodies usually give us a clue as to what's going on. This is something that actually one of our teens had shared, that we like the idea of too, of recognizing that our minds aren't a lunch tray, right? We're not necessarily feeling like 10% of this one day and 20% of that. And one thing we talk a lot about is modeling that we can feel multiple things at once, right? We can be really frustrated with our teenager for not turning in a homework assignment and really grateful that they're safe and healthy. And so trying to help explain that, and that it can be difficult to piece it all out at times, and we can work on it. Another way to kind of work on the accepting is thinking about ways we can use positive self-talk or validate ourselves for getting through. So this is another visual on something that can be helpful, is kind of, if we know there are moments where our teen is really anxious, what are some of the things that they could remind themselves of, whether it's a picture of a favorite place or a favorite card from a loved one, maybe some statements like this. A lot of our teens have found it helpful to have a specific space where they're doing e-learning that has some comforting things, right? So maybe one thing for each of their 5 senses, or a favorite fidget, or always having their favorite tea to sip on when they're working on their toughest class. So things like that we can really plan ahead for when our brains or bodies start to struggle, to really help ourselves stay grounded and feel connected. This is another thing we talk a lot about with the teens, is this idea of breaking it down, right? If we're overwhelmed and it's hard to tolerate, how do we notice, name, sit with, and then let it go? We talk a lot about the idea that feelings aren't facts. Feelings don't last forever, right? Sometimes we'll talk about it as feelings are, pre-COVID days, like a house guest, right? So someone who dropped by, you might not be thrilled they popped in on you. You still say their name, you welcome them in, you sit with them, and they're going to leave. And that's the same for our emotions. And so sometimes something like this that's very in order can help kind of break some of that down for our teens. Just as another thing that can sometimes help is keeping it really small, right? So if I'm feeling really overwhelmed by my test tomorrow, rather than thinking of all the things, breaking it down to like, what am I feeling? Where am I feeling it? What is this telling me? And then what's one small step? That thing in the top left we talk a lot about. What's a reasonable start, right? So if I can't get all of my missing work done, or I can't, text all of my friends to reconnect tonight because I've been struggling to keep up, what's one small thing? And really breaking it down. Anything you want to add here, Emily?
I would say that this slide I love because it aligns so beautifully with academics, right? Everything is terrible. Lots of very big statements, and to make it as small and as simple as possible and piece things out. What can I do? How do I feel about what I'm doing? How can I improve how I feel about what I'm doing in a small way? And if I'm overwhelmed by math, for example, what is that telling me about my relationship with math, my need for help with regard to math, how I learn? Those are very small components of things that are much larger.
And I think as parents and as caregivers, we have a tendency to want to fix when things are really stressful. And I think something like this also helps empower our teens to identify some steps they can take for themselves, right? To model that skill of, I can be really overwhelmed and I don't need you to zip it up for me. And sometimes they don't want us to, right? But can we say, okay, if your step is, I'm going to put one thing on a Post-it note and I'm going to set a timer. And when that's done, I'm going to take the Post-it note off. That assignment is done enough or good enough to submit. And I'm going to take a walk outside for 10 minutes. And then what's our role in saying, great job, or I'll go for a walk with you. So I think this can also help to model that self-sufficiency and coping with some of this.
And I would add, as a parent, certainly it's incredibly complicated, especially given the circumstances that we're in, not to try to fix things. It's all, I spend quite a bit of time backing myself off from fixing things or trying to fix things. And I find that when I step back and I say, so I'm going to let you try to fix a little bit of this, and I'm going to support you as you try, I feel better, and my kids feel better about it. And we get along a lot better, truthfully.
Yeah. Can also be helpful to have like a set time of day to check in. I think for a lot of teens, we've also heard like my mom or dad is checking in with me all the time about how I'm doing on my math. And so can we give a little control of like, hey, what would be the best, which time today do you want to check in about it? Is it at dinner? Is it at breakfast? But, giving a little bit of control around that conversation can be helpful too. So building off of that idea of tolerating uncertainty, I think one thing we've explored a lot is this idea of uncertainty or anxiety loves power and control, right? So we know for all of us, when things feel more unsure, unstable, stressful, we look for ways that we can gain a sense of power and control, and being mindful of that dynamic, right? Sometimes that's healthy in terms of making a to-do list or doing things like that. Other times it might be that we are really struggling with letting our team maybe struggle or have some small failures on their own, or disengaging because we're so eager to control or have power over these things that we truly can't or are really stressful. So I think that's something we've talked with a lot of families about, is that we may all be looking for some power and control. Where are those tug of wars or power struggles at home? When do we want to pick up that rope and engage? And when do we want to say it's actually an okay choice to drop the rope and not engage with my teen around that today because I want to preserve my energy or our relationship or other things? Another thing we've talked a lot about is can we be patient without being stagnant or not moving, right? A lot of teenagers we've talked about have said, well, I'm going to wait till we get back fully in school, and then I feel like I can talk to my Spanish teacher about that. Or I want to wait till this happens. And so how do we balance that? Some things, like maybe getting an answer from your teacher, are going to take longer because the teacher is doing a million more things to support, and saying, can I work on something while I'm waiting for that response? Another thing is the idea of being stuck. So we can feel stuck and we don't have to choose to be stuck. So again, that idea of, if we don't have a ton of certainty, can we still take some small steps in the direction of our goal? There's a lot here. And one thing we talk a lot about at Compass is, how do we cope ahead? So always attending to our coping in the moment and thinking about, if we preview a little bit out, what are the things that we could say, I can prep some skills or supports for this, or can you help me ahead of time for that? Some of the conversations we're having a lot of is, what are the things we know we can plan for? How do we balance having a plan and being flexible, right? I feel like COVID has taught a lot of us we need to have a plan A through G maybe, versus just plan A and B. And Emily, will you speak to what we can still have and let go of? I know that's one of the things you've done a lot of work with our families.
Right. I spend a lot of time talking to teenagers, both in my house and out, I should say, about what still exists, what we can hold and what we can't hold. So there are pieces of our lives that we, both big and small, that we have to sort of let go of, right? So we can't go to football games, right? But can we have 5 friends in our yard to watch football on a screen? Yes. Right. What can we get together with family? Yes. Does it need to be in the garage or in the yard? Yes. We need to figure out ways for kids to recognize that there are pieces to keep and pieces that either we let go of and it's okay, or they're different. And it may feel like it's a letting go, but it's not actually a letting go. It's more of a shift. Mm-hmm. And that shift is a model that kids really, they need to learn. They need to learn quickly, and they need to apply it everywhere they go. Mm-hmm. So their ability to do that, sadly in this circumstance, to learn it this profoundly will actually serve them well moving forward. It's not the way we want them to learn that skill, but it is a really important skill.
And I think building off of that, one thing we've talked a lot about is that obviously your students are learning a ton academically, mm-hmm. and we are also helping our teens learn a lot of skills that maybe you're not taking a test or quiz for, right? The things like Emily's talking about in terms of being flexible, shifting our expectations, advocating for ourselves, things that we all know you need to be successful in college and careers and relationships. And can we also help model that of this is really tough, and this is a lesson that I think will help you in these other ways. One thing we've also talked a lot about are what are reasonable expectations or structures. I think for some families, the staying home is okay. I don't think I can have any limits on electronics anymore because we need them everywhere. And for other families, it's felt like I have to have really rigid expectations, and what works for your family. It is still okay to have limits. It is still okay to have consequences or things that kids have to work toward. And so being mindful of, if we're going to set any kind of expectation or plan up, it needs to be something that you feel confident in following through. So, we all know like setting a limit we can't hold can be kind of not effective in the end. And it's okay to think about like what's really reasonable for us now as a family. And it's okay to say no and have your teen have to tolerate that at times too.
Right. And I would say that in terms of academics and parenting, those limits are really comforting. Those expectations are very comforting for kids in general. So like, on Thursdays, we still change our sheets. We all do our homework after dinner, end of conversation. That's the way it goes. I know it's weird. And I know that in April, it didn't look like that. Mm-hmm. But things are that's what we're holding on to. This is the framework this is the foundation of how we function, and we're going to hold those things in place, right? We still turn our phones in at the end of the night. I know that in May, everybody kept their phones in their rooms all the time, but that's not where we are right now. And these are the expectations. Those are actually grounding and safe, and they're refreshing for kids. They ask for them, whether they ask out loud or not.
Yeah, I think one thing we know about teenagers is they don't want limits and they need them, right? And so I think that idea of all teens, we talk about this idea of limits are love, and limits are a way of expressing love and helping teens to learn. And that layer of when things are uncertain, like we all find ourselves wanting more black and white, right? More kind of structure, concrete yes or no. And in some ways, the things that Emily is talking about can provide that as well. Another thing we've talked a lot about is the idea of in every crisis, there's opportunity, right? So what are the opportunities there are now in COVID? Is it an opportunity to have family game night or to spend more time, watching a favorite show together? Are there ways we can be creative that maybe we wouldn't have had time or space for before? And lastly, another one of our favorite phrases at Compass is the idea of trying differently, right? I think sometimes when we're frustrated, we might want our teens or say things like, we want you to try harder or do more, or, now you really have to get a better score on the SAT because everyone's going to have more time to write their college essay, or really kind of pushing those expectations on ourselves or our teens, and thinking instead of if we feel frustrated or overwhelmed or kind of stuck, how could we try differently, right? We like the idea of people do well when they can, and we're all trying our best. So rather than saying try more or try harder, how can we try different? And so I know we talked a lot about this structure and routine piece. I think one thing that we have also talked a lot about is what are the things that we can schedule that are normal, right? So like Emily said, we change our sheets on Thursday. Are there traditions that we have? Obviously things like any of the holidays will look different. And if our families at Thanksgiving usually do a whole big thing leading up, it might not be the same. And it can be really powerful if we always have, a 30-person family event where everyone tells a funny story from the year, that we figure that out over Zoom or over email or find another way to do that. As small as those may feel, things like a, Friday night pizza night or Thursday changing the sheets, or, our family does, drives and sees the foliage every year. Anything like that can really feel more important. And as much as the teens might give you an eye roll during, I think Emily and I can attest that for a lot of the ones we work with, when we ask to share a moment that's gone well in the week, we will hear things like that of my family and I did this together, or I still had my, Tuesday afternoon, checking with my friends on FaceTime, as things that stand out. Another thing we've talked a lot about is this idea of shifting our mindset, right? So if we can't shift all the circumstances around us or control them, how can we help bring more attention into our minds and shift the way that we're approaching or thinking about things? And I love this little graphic just showing all the different opportunities. So one thing we talk a lot about, and this is a skill on the academic side as well as the social emotional, is cognitive flexibility, right? So how can we have an idea of, this is what my heart was set on, this is what I was thinking, this is what I was planning, and now I have to pause and reset. So I think from the emotional side, being able to say, we can have hopes, and can we express our frustration or disappointment and find ways to reroute? Emily, will you share more about how that's looked academically?
So we've talked a lot about how students can adjust their academics and addressing academics and the rigor of academics in general. Studying looks very different now. Grades look very different now, and yet there's still rigor, right? So I think that we need to recognize that everyone is doing their level best to work to the best of their ability, and also there needs to be flexibility attached to what everybody actually can do given the circumstances. That's not to say that homework doesn't get done, right? Or that tests don't get studied for. That's just to say things look a little bit different in terms of the addressing of those things, and advocating for needs with regard to that should look different as well. I think right away of things like SATs and ACTs. That jumps to my head, jumps up right away. While those are not necessarily the same, don't have the same imperative they did a year ago, we as parents still see tremendous value in that, and certainly academic environments still see value in that. And I think that there's a piece to recognizing that there's impact, I think, and we need to be flexible in our thinking about how our kids are focused on their academics.
I think being mindful of how we're thinking about things, being open to feedback, and knowing that there are times it might be hard for us to shift our mindset or change our expectations. I think we also talk a lot about the idea of energy distribution. So we don't have more hours in the day because we have a pandemic, yet I know a lot of us feel like we're working or studying or doing other things more or longer. And so just being mindful of, if our energy is finite, like how do we want to allocate that throughout the day and throughout our family and in our relationships and our academics? And also noticing when are times we want to challenge our mindset, when do we want to kind of just reframe or maybe zoom in, zoom out, and when do we want to kind of take some space and really separate from what we're thinking. One thing we talk a lot about at Compass is acceptance, and this is a graphic Emily and I both like, which I think is very simplified, and right, the idea of we can look at the rain and think of all the other things. Acceptance doesn't mean liking what's going on. It means saying, yep, it's raining, that's happening, and accepting that is there. We talk a lot about this idea of radical acceptance. So if we can acknowledge what's going on around us, can we recognize that there are certain things in our control and out of our control? For a lot of our teens and for us, if we are feeling stuck, frustrated, overwhelmed, that might be a time where we're putting a lot of energy into those things in this circle here of what I can't control. We've all had moments we felt stuck in the mud, right? Whether it's you're sitting in traffic and going down a rabbit hole in your head of now I'm going to be late and I'm going to be behind and everyone's going to be frustrated. Or maybe, your team didn't get a text back from a friend and they're thinking now no one likes me, I'm going to be off the group chat. Being mindful of when our energy goes there and can we recognize it and maybe shift it back to things that are in our control. Another thing that comes more from kind of actually the academic and planning world is the thing on the right, which is the idea similarly of what we can control ourselves, what we have influence over in our world, and then things we really can't control that are more concerns rather than things we can impact directly. Another way to think about this, and this has been one of my favorites from the pandemic, is talking about what's called the struggle switch. So this comes from what's called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is an evidence-based therapy for a lot of different things, including anxiety, depression, and stress. And a lot of the ideas here are about our values and being mindful about what's coming up for us. So the struggle switch is this idea that in our heads, when we start to maybe get anxious, a lot of times we'll switch the struggle switch on, being now we're anxious that we're anxious. So we're anxious that we're anxious about our math test, and I can't believe I'm freaking out about this. I'm never going to do well. Then we might get angry that we're anxious of like, well, now I'm so worked up about this, I'm never going to be able to study. Then we might feel sad that we're angry, right? Like, well, I'm such a bad person. Like I'm a bad student. Now I'm all upset with myself and I'm really nervous. And all of a sudden, like the anxiety was already hard to sit with. Now we have all this layered on and we're struggling with that emotion, taking more energy away from what we really want to be doing or taking care of ourselves. And there's a great short YouTube video on this. We can send the link out that really has some nice graphics and it's like 2 or 3 minutes. about this idea of how can we notice when that switch is on. And by turning it off, we're not saying the anxiety goes away or saying we feel great or there's rainbows and butterflies everywhere. And we're recognizing that we can sit with the anxiety without letting ourselves struggle more. And being mindful that idea of letting go could be something small, like taking a deep breath or an exhale, rather than a whole, I've totally, let my homework go for 3 hours or something like that. It might be just a moment. You probably heard us talk about both things at once. So that's another kind of mindset of this idea of a dialectic, or that two opposing things can be true at the same time, right? We can be really concerned that our student gets into a great college and understand that going to college looks really different now, right? We can feel really worried about how to balance our job and parenting and be really grateful that we have a job that we love doing. So trying to model that for our teens, I think, is really important. We do a lot of catching ourselves if we say, I've had a really great day, but I'm really tired, to I've had a really great day and I'm feeling really tired, as a way to kind of validate that things can come up in more than one space.
From an academic perspective, this often looks like, I don't know how to write this paper and I can write an outline. Or I don't understand anything about the Revolutionary War and I can fill out the note sheet. And so we try to figure out ways to break things apart so that we're not necessarily, there's never certainly in academics, there's never an or.
Mm-hmm. I think we also talk a lot about, especially if maybe the student has fallen behind or missed something, of I don't know how to catch up right now and I can email my teacher and ask. Things like that, self-advocacy can come in handy there. We did talk about adjusting expectations some, and I think this is something to talk through with our teens and with ourselves too, of from our expectations of our teens and of our families right now, what are we actually expecting? Can we name it explicitly? Is it something that feels doable, or do we have expectations that like our teens and ourselves haven't been able to meet all of COVID? Or are we crushing those expectations and needing to change them? And really being mindful of what are we holding on to? I think for a lot of teenagers and families, we have learned we're attaching a lot more emotion to specific things that might not be about that, right? So that one math class that it's really hard to maybe advocate to change or shift, is it just about the math class, or is that math class representing like what we really wanted out of the junior year for our kid, or they wanted for themselves? And is there other weight attached that we might be able to kind of reshuffle or consider letting go? And then lastly, being mindful of an expectation versus a suggestion. This is something that always comes up when I work with teens, and especially now, of are we saying it would be great if you would unload the dishwasher, or are we saying that my expectation is that you unload the dishwasher before we watch Netflix? So even in little ways like that, can we be really thoughtful of our framing? And then looking forward, being mindful that for all of you, we know conferences are coming up, and that will be, a time to really have face-to-face, and thinking about ways that you could cope ahead, whether that's maybe checking in with your team beforehand and saying, what are you expecting to come up? Or what are, 2 things that have really gone well in this class, and what are 2 things that maybe, you're still working on, or you could need some support around. For some teenagers, if they're really worried about that, it might be planning some skills to use when they know the conferences are happening, or something to look forward to after. And similarly for those schedule changes, when, the students are coming back in the building more, or things are shifting, can we help to preview setting the alarm a little bit earlier if it's going to mean them getting up at a different time, or visualizing what that walk through the building will be, or packing an extra snack for the drive home. Things like that I think can help ease those transitions.
I would also encourage you talking to your kids and saying things like, what kinds of concerns do you have? What questions do you have? Where are you at with regard to each of your subjects, each of your teachers? Or what do you think your teachers will share with me? See if you can get into their perspective of things. Oftentimes as parents, we have a very different lens in terms of the way that we think things should go, the way conversations with school should go, the way communication should go, and what our kids need sometimes is discrepant.
Mm-hmm. I think, if that's not a conversation that you've had, thinking about, we will oftentimes approach with like a radical curiosity, right? So I'm curious what you're thinking about conferences this week, or what do you think will come up, or we haven't really talked about this much, or ways like that can encourage your team to kind of engage in the conversation. And if you get a lot of I don't knows, maybe saying like, that's okay, you want to check in about it later, or here's some things I'm thinking about as a way to kind of keep that coming.
And you can also circle back to that feelings wheel that we had referred to a while back and say, if there's like, well, I don't know how I feel. You can always identify what their body is doing in that moment. Well, I'm noticing that you're fidgeting with your fingers a lot while we're talking about this. Are you nervous about something? Are you concerned about something? Your body is telling me, or your affect is telling me that you're frustrated by something. Do you want to tell me about that?
I think a lot of teens we work with too might want to kind of say like, I'll write 3 things down and bring them to dinner tomorrow, right? Or might need a little time to process. And then lastly here, thinking about the holidays. So knowing again that those can bring up a lot of emotion for our families. Some are more comfortable, some are more distressing, but lots of things there that we use as benchmarks or ways to check in, or traditions. And also from the academic side, things that might shift the amount of time they have to do homework or kind of planning ahead for, and just noticing that those are on the horizon, and other things that might impact kind of our schedules or conversations with our teams. And after we just talked for about 40 minutes about all these things, making some space for recognizing there is a lot going on, and by no means do we have to sort through everything at once, right? I think that can feel like when we have those moments with ourselves or our teens that we want to get to everything that's behind the academics for them, or everything that might be stressing them out, or try to problem solve or fix or explore all the things at once, and really being gentle with ourselves, that we are all doing the best we can and taking it one day at a time. We do want to make time for some questions. So if you have any, please feel free to chat them and we will get to everything we can.
Thank you so much. That was great. I was taking copious notes. And even though I only have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, a lot of what you were saying, I'm going to be applying and trying with them. Please feel free to enter any questions. You can enter them in the Q&A. You can also enter them in the chat. I saw a couple of you were putting questions in there. So one did come up. Could either of you speak about sleep schedules and the importance of getting the minimum amount of sleep? However, the student is pushing back, wanting to control something right now. Mm-hmm. So the one thing they're going to control is the sleep. And I understand that. I see that in the kids in the classroom. And they share their lack thereof sleep. Some of them I think are getting a lot and feeling much better, but a lot of them I'm seeing that as well.
Totally. I'm happy to start us off and then give some space for Emily to chime in as well. I think, one thing 100% teens want to control, and I think sleep is an area, you're right, where they're maybe in their rooms by themselves and feel like they can finally have like control over a timeline or their decisions. One way that sometimes we approach it is to talk about, there's actually something called sleep hygiene, right? Research on what good sleep is. So like, yes, you may think you can go on 4 hours, and there's like a lot of research and data to back up that long-term your brain functions better when A, B, and C. So for some teens, that's a helpful approach, even with a little bit of an eye roll in there. For others, maybe not so much. I think the idea of, we talk a lot about like the basic needs, right? So on that pyramid of things we all need: sleep, healthy food, exercise, taking any medication or attending to medical needs, and some kind of connection every day. And so if, for example, a teen's going to bed at 1 a.m. every night, if we have a conversation where we're like, I read an article and I think 10 p.m. is your best bet, that's probably going to be a tough one. I think sometimes framing it as small steps, right? So if your teen's really stuck on that, while you're doing something like cooking together or going for a walk, sometimes that not direct eye contact is easier for a tough conversation, saying, hey, I'm really concerned about your sleep. I know you're not. And I'd like for us to, to see what it might be like to try differently next week. Seems like you're going to bed around 1, like, if you had to shift that time a little bit, what would you propose? And then kind of a back and forth, and see if, even if it's just like a 1 to 12:30, I think any momentum there could be helpful. For other teens, it's maybe trying to track how they're feeling throughout the day. So if you notice your teen crashing at some point, can you find a gentle way to say, like, I wonder if you might not hit that 3 p.m. slump if, we try this a little differently. So I think those are things that could be helpful. Anything you want to add around the sleep piece, Emily?
So I can say certainly from the parent perspective, I have my best conversations in cars and in grocery stores with my kids for the most part. And I tend to open with the phrase, I'm noticing. I do a lot of I'm noticing. So I'm noticing that this isn't working, or I'm noticing that you're really petering out at 4 p.m. We need to brainstorm a way to solve this problem. This is not working. I know that's hard for you to hear, but I can see it. And then opening the conversation that way. I do always circle back, certainly with regard to sleep. I tend to be, both as an educator and as a parent, I tend to be a little bit of a hard line in terms of sleep, because I don't think that children up until they're, in their 20s really have a strong sense of what really is healthy for them on that front. I think limits are love in this situation to a very large degree. I think that if your kids have their phones in their rooms, finding a time when that either gets powered down, shut down, turned in, because it really isn't a healthy choice, is great. And if that's not the case, then brainstorm around that conversation with your kids. How can we make this work so that you're getting what you need in terms of your health, and it's not a battle that you and I are having? I will say that I just actually read a really nice study that said one of the benefits of this whole pandemic experience is that teens by and large are getting more sleep, and that's really developmentally quite good.
Mm-hmm. I think lastly, if you're noticing that conversation is hard, one thing that we do a lot of is if you notice your teen getting kind of irritable, we do a lot of kind of like stop and check. So a skill I love is called HALT, which is obviously literally means to halt, and to say, like, let's pause. Are we hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? And you'll get tired a lot of times, and starting to build that awareness in, like, if your teen doesn't really know what's wrong, or you're noticing them being kind of snappy, building in some of that self-awareness. And that could give you some data over time to say, like, hey, I've noticed the past few days when that's come up, you've said you're tired consistently, and that could be another way to lead in.
We thank you so much. We have another question. A couple questions came in about sort of the social interaction and isolation, especially around like limiting computer time, with a lot of their days consumed on electronics, and that kids who might be less extroverted, how to help build them to build social connections and reduce electronic time.
Such a great question, and so tough. I think that's one of the things we've talked about for a long time is a lot of parents will say, I do want to set a limit on my kid's phone. And there's not a lot of time to set limits if by the time they're done with homework, they need to, they want to log on to a house party or things like that. I think a lot of what we talked about, again, is small steps. If it's a tough thing, thinking about, are there any non-screen things that your teen likes to do or that could be engaging, and maybe even having a list of those. We have some families that will say, from 4 to 6, we're not doing screen. So we make ahead, whether it's a list or like a jar with a popsicle stick you pull out, or some other things to kind of say, like walking a dog, writing a postcard or a letter. I know a lot of our kids haven't done that, but things like that. Or, is your family comfortable with taking a walk and meeting a friend distanced from afar? There are even some social skills groups or more structured things like that are available in person or online some places. It could be even something like reading a book together, or, we've had some kids say we're gonna, watch a show during our screen time and then find a way to talk about it later together. So I think, being mindful of what non-screen activities can be, and then if it is something social, still having a limit on that, so that your teen can have some time away. And it may end up being more screen time than pre-COVID, and that might be something we have to accept too.
I want to speak a little bit also about how students to get involved in formation. What counselors have really done this year, we've pivoted and met to meet the needs of our students. And we've been using a lot of the time for community building, for students to get to know one another. We've been doing a lot of the Yale mood meter so that they can identify more of their feelings of what's happening. We've been having them work with partners, socially distant apart, but to ask them questions of, getting to know you, the community building activities. Our student activities director, she's been doing a phenomenal job with getting kids engaged online and when they're on campus. Usually during lunch periods, they have a fun activity or something for the kids to do. We also have LA Way will be coming in with the freshmen. I know one question here was about freshmen specifically, to work with them as well, and they'll be doing community building activities there for students to give a chance to meet people. And that was part of our, our big push was to get the students as many as we could as safely as possible in the buildings, that they can have those times for building those relationships. So that's so important right now, the social connection with teens and peers. So that's something that we are very mindful of. Another question came in: how do you deal with a teenage girl who's very moody and sometimes not nice? And how can you get her to be more engaged and out of the mood when they're in the mood?
I saw your face light up, Emily, so I will let you start.
This is like somebody is in my house right now. That's amazing. So I would say the name of the game, quite honestly, is validate and distract. Those are the two things. You seem irritable, let's go for a walk. There's a lot of validating and distracting. Sometimes not so much of the validating, quite honestly. Sometimes it's just I need to go to the grocery store. I need some help, put on a mask. You need to help me figure out what we're doing for dinner. And that kind of conversation that has zero to do with mood, zero to do with attitude, that doesn't poke or pry or even engage, is really, it tends to work real well. The other thing I'll do is I will, I've done this with students because, certainly in a classroom setting, I've dealt with my share of, like moody, irritable students, and writing notes works. Like a little post-it. These are the 3 things that I need you to do, or here are 3 things I think you should know. And then just kind of removing yourself from the conversation, but still having the conversation on paper. That tends to help a lot. Again, I would come back to the idea of that dandelion, the image from that dandelion. It is a mood, it is a moment, and it will pass. And as adults, we need to always recognize that the moods that our kids are having, they're often having 47 of them within a 3-hour window, and they all pass. So we just have to kind of step back and wait for it to pass.
I agree. I think, from like a clinical standpoint, also that idea of you'd likely have a different approach in the moment and out of the moment, right? So I think what Emily is saying for sure of, can we reflect back and validate in the moment and then help to reroute? I think when your teenage girl is the moodiest is probably not going to be the most effective time to say, like, it drives me nuts when you're really moody and do A, B, and C, or I don't know how to help you when this is coming up for me. And so I think having a conversation when maybe she's in a different space, maybe a little brighter or a little more regulated, to say, hey, I'm noticing that like you have these moments that are really tough, and normalizing that for teenagers, regardless of gender, lots of hormones searching. I'm noticing that comes up and I can tell it seems like it's really intense for you. What are the ways I can be supportive, right? Or what are the things that we can do? And kind of having that, planning ahead conversation when she's in a different space. And then in the moment, again, like Emily said, trying to distract, trying to bring our brains to something else, right? I think especially with that irritability, it feels like everything might be frustrating them or everything's really pissing them off and it's hard for anything to go well. Something as small as like, taking a few deep breaths, or really squeezing a cold ice cube, or having a specific task of chopping the onions or something like that, where your brain is focused fully on what you're doing in that moment, kind of helps to call a timeout on some of those intense emotions or thoughts and bring it back to just what's going on there. So I do think that can be really helpful as well.
Another question, Emily, this might be a really good one for you, around ideas for helping our students feel more engaged as learners, as it's becoming, it can feel like a chore. I know we've been in it, we're only October, and I see it too with students just seeming tired, like they've already done a whole school year in just 2 months. And, like kind of losing some of those social connections that make it fun to go to school, things like that. So any suggestions to help our students keep up their engagement?
That's a great question. I certainly would say, well, let me start by saying the things that you can do outside of school to help with in-school engagement are to allow for space to do things differently. So homework can be done in a yard, certainly in small groups, distanced and appropriate, but you can create a social setting out of that. I would say keeping kids engaged in their academics that's hard to do in this situation, truthfully, but I think that one of the ways I might do it is to allow kids to just to organize themselves in different ways. Certainly utilizing planners, organizers, docs, anything that helps them to kind of take control of the situation and to plan for their own education, where we might have kind of imparted information to them, let them own more of it, and that allows them to kind of invest, I would say, to invest in their own process as opposed to feeling like it's happening to them. I'm kind of coming around my elbow to get to my thumb on this one. It's a very good question. I think that that's probably where I would land, is on the idea of kids really being able to drive the bus in terms of their own process on that one.
I think also connecting it to something bigger, right? Like, just like we've talked about, that our emotions aren't there for forever, neither is high school, right? And so connecting it to, why are we doing this? Like, yes, it can be draining, and like, this English class is going to help you learn how to write a great paper that will help you get here. Like, sometimes bringing it to that bigger picture. Or like, we've had some families who said, like, once a month we're doing, like, everyone has 2 minutes and you have to make a PowerPoint about something you learned this month. And it could be like little, like, I learned how to use my locker for the first time. I never could open it before, or whatever, but some way to kind of even bring some of that curiosity or learning into the family, even if it's like watching a nature documentary or something else, but kind of revamping that idea of, like, yes, there are some parts of going through the motions of e-learning that can be draining, and like, what are the things that can be exciting about the content, even if the process is challenging. I think that has been helpful for some kids too.
I do want to add, in terms of the remote learning piece, one of the ways that we've worked with students to kind of reinvigorate themselves is to rotate to different spaces in their houses, so that you're not always in your room at your desk by yourself. So the social studies is in the living room, and English is in the kitchen, and math is in your room, and Spanish is in the yard. And in that way, their kind of movement allows them to kind of re-energize and reconnect and ground in terms of getting some work done as well. And it models a little bit of the movement around a school building. Part of the reason kids move from class to class is because they need the stimulation and the physicality of the movement of that, of the hallways. So if we can emulate that, it's really helpful to them in terms of coming back to center and focusing on their education.
I think anything creative too. Like, we've had some students who've said, like, I do well when I listen to music when I'm doing my Spanish homework, and I'm going to make like a fun Spotify playlist and share it with my siblings, or like something like that, where it can be something that might be creative or expressive that's tied to that, like, homework time or around it. I think anything like that, where it can be a little bit different or, maybe borderline fun, can be helpful.
I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, and we're just at about 8 o'clock. I feel like I could listen to you two speak. You're very creative. You have lots of tangible ideas and strategies. I really appreciate this. I want to think there was a parent in there who posted the YouTube, the struggle switch, into the chat. So thank you for that. And I wanted to quote, another parent had said how we are constantly pivoting here. And, I love how you said that. Navigating this is a constant pivot, Maria Lynch. It is. And that is one of the reasons why, we partnered with Compass to really make a program that we felt was pertinent to your needs and timely. And we are going to continue to address the needs as, where we'll be in a few months, which is why we haven't laid out specific topics or dates, because we're hearing the community, we're hearing your needs, and we're trying to put quality programs specifically together for our parents. So thank you so much for your time.
Of course, I think, knowing that the quarter is ending, finding ways to say everyone did the best they could this quarter. How do you name it? How do you celebrate it? And then how do you look forward? So we are grateful to have been part of that process for your community. And if there's any questions after, please feel free to send them to the Loyola team, and they can get them along to us.
This was recorded, and it will be posted on campus under the counseling resource tile, as well as on Compass's website. Give us a few days for that. There will be a handout. If you want to see the first presentation that we did with them in the spring, that is also on campus under the counseling resource tile, as well as on Compass's website. There was a question if the slide deck would be available.
We can definitely do that as well. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Of
Well,
course.
this has been a wonderful evening with everybody. It was great to see a lot of familiar names up there. I appreciate you all tuning into our programming. And any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. We are here for you, and your school counselors are here for you as well. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.